Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. Today we'll be strapping in for a wild ride of a horror movie from 2021. And before we get to the case coverage itself, I have to put a disclaimer in here. If you haven't seen this movie and you have any interest in doing so whatsoever, I'd highly recommend checking it out first before spoiling the various twists and turns. Seriously, going into this movie blind is definitely the best way to go. So if you are interested, watch the movie first, and in the meantime, maybe catch up on some of our other episodes. It's the story of a newly widowed woman who, after narrowly surviving an alleged attack at her family home, finds herself as the prime suspect in a series of violent murders. And while she somehow has first-hand knowledge of the crimes in question, this suspect denies any and all involvement, claiming, if you believe the reports, some sort of almost psychic connection with the actual killer. Now, the reality would prove to be far more surreal, and the connection between the alleged killer and their victims may prove to be one of the most shocking cases yet. I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is Malignant. It's 2020 in Seattle, Washington, and the city is about to experience one of the most bizarre and twisted cases it would see in years. At approximately 4 a.m., police dispatch receives a phone call from a concerned citizen reporting screams from an adjacent residence, indicating a potential disturbance of some kind, possibly domestic in nature. When police and ambulance arrive on the scene, they discover a deceased male on the main floor of the home. The body is identified as Derek Mitchell, homeowner and husband of surviving victim Madison Mitchell, and police suspect foul play due to the condition of the body itself. Coroner reports detail that Derek died via extensive trauma to his neck, injuries that were so severe that they resulted in the collapse of his airway, as well as the protrusion of broken bones from his skin tissue. Now, police statements taken from surviving witness and wife to the victim, 35-year-old Madison Mitchell, suggest that she was unaware of what events may have led to Derek's actual death in the home, and that she simply discovered the body after falling asleep in the master bedroom earlier that evening, after her and her husband allegedly had some kind of a domestic altercation. Now, this survivor also indicates that she was attacked by an unidentified assailant, presumably that of Derek's killer, and that the assault occurred upon the discovery of his body downstairs. She was knocked unconscious during the altercation with the murderer and was subsequently transported to a nearby hospital by paramedics where she would undergo medical attention and later provide statements to investigators. But while this witness seems to claim her innocence, police already begin to form their own theories about what happened leading up to the violent murder at the Mitchell residence. And right from the start, investigators would paint Madison Mitchell as a potential suspect. Upon executing a search of the residence, investigators led by Seattle homicide detectives Kakoa Shaw and Regina Moss discover that there's no signs of forced entry to the home. The killer in question had to already be inside the house or had somehow been given access voluntarily, a common signal in police work that the suspect may have actually been known to the victim. In addition, no actual fingerprints can be located on the scene, and the trauma wounds to Derek Mitchell's neck are also negative for suspect prints, indicating the killer possibly wore gloves during the murder. However, investigators would make another finding on Derek's body that, while initially puzzling, would eventually help police in making sense of the entire case itself. While Derek's body didn't have any suspect fingerprints, autopsy and crime scene photos showcase bruising impressions in the shape of a human hand that are clearly visible on the victim's neck. There's only one catch. These handprints are completely upside down, a chilling fact that would only make sense upon the near conclusion of the investigation sometime later. The murder of Derek Mitchell would only be the start of the tragedy to follow the Mitchell family. In the days following the initial murder, Madison Mitchell would endure another unbearable loss when, tragically, she would suffer a miscarriage. And likely in part due to this medical emergency, as detectives wrap up their initial investigation, Madison is seemingly cleared as a suspect in her husband's murder, instead chalking up the attack as a random and tragic home invasion. Though in the eyes of police and investigators, it wouldn't stay that way for long. It would be a full 2 weeks before a second murder takes place, And while police wouldn't make the connection immediately, they would eventually discover that it was by the same killer who struck the Mitchell residence only a few weeks prior. The second victim in these 2020 Seattle murders is that of prominent and highly decorated medical practitioner Dr. Florence Weaver. Her body was first discovered by her housekeeper at approximately 8:30 a.m. on the main floor of her residence, specifically in the kitchen, where she had been viciously attacked and murdered by a then unknown assailant. In this case, it's noted by responding investigators that the killer likely gained access by means of forced entry and launched a brutal attack on the victim shortly thereafter. Weaver was ultimately killed after suffering a series of 4 blunt force trauma wounds to her head from a weapon that was later discovered to be a medical trophy issued by Northwest Medical Research Association, found missing from its display in the heavily vandalized study area of the home. The extensive damage to the victim's body indicates to police that the killer may have actually known the victim and harbored some kind of a grudge, as focused violence, such as exhibited in this specific crime, are typically associated with such behavioral cues, possibly providing some kind of a potential link between the killer and this specific murder victim. And during a routine search of the crime scene, police make another harrowing discovery, this time in the belongings of victim Florence Weaver. Dr. Weaver kept extensive patient records in her home, including a dated picture showcasing a team of medical experts, which included future victims in the case, as well as a Polaroid of an 8-year-old female patient, specifically dated 1992, that advanced aging software analysis would suggest is none other than current suspect Madison Mitchell. The photo in question now provides police with irrefutable evidence connecting Madison Mitchell to 2 victims in these series of murders, making her prime suspect number 1 in the eyes of investigators. And from here on out, the prosecution would only prove to be more incriminating. While police continued their investigation, the third victim in the case would be discovered violently murdered. Autopsy reports name this victim as Victor Fields, another prominent surgeon in the Seattle area, who was found deceased in bed, located in his own top-floor apartment number 51 in North Beacon Hill apartment complex. Fields' cause of death is revealed to be the result of 6 major stab wounds to his torso and face, where investigators indicate that he died from a combination of shock and massive blood loss thereafter. But at this point in the investigation, things seem to take an unexpected turn. The discovery of Dr. Fields' body came from a tip, not from a random witness or a concerned citizen, but rather from prime suspect Madison Mitchell. Now, to pause for a moment, while police had their initial suspicions that victim Madison may have been somehow involved in the murder of her own husband, she was ultimately cleared. Only now, it seems, her statements to police with the support of her own sister, who police and reports name as Sydney Lake, offer intricate details of these various crime scenes that she quite frankly could not have possibly otherwise known. Madison claims to police that she had suffered some sort of a vision or dreamlike state of the various murders in question, including detailed descriptions of the victims as well as circumstances surrounding their own deaths. And this includes another major lead for investigators in the case, in the form of a description of the alleged killer himself, a male-presenting individual with severe facial deformities who allegedly goes by the name Gabriel. And it wouldn't be long before this Gabriel would strike again, this time claiming the life of another highly decorated doctor and surgeon, Dr. John Gregory. Lead Detective Shaw performed a wellness check on this doctor after discovering his photograph along with other victims of the case and suspecting a potential link or a pattern. You have to think that the last 2 victims in the case were both prominent doctors in the area, and it was known to police at this point that Gregory himself was a partner to these other 2 murder victims at some point in his career. Now, this hunch would lead Detective Shaw to Gregory's body, which crime scene photos showcase was located in the bathroom of his penthouse, specifically in the bathtub. He was found to have been killed by numerous penetrative wounds to the torso, later discovered to have been the work of the weaponized trophy stolen from prior victim Dr. Weaver's own home. But this no doubt gruesome discovery would come with a new twist to the case. Detective Shaw encountered the male perpetrator known as Gabriel, still within the confines of the penthouse apartment. But after a brief altercation, including the discharging of Shaw's firearm, the suspect was able to successfully elude police. And it's the following day, during a routine visit for questioning at the Mitchell residence, lead investigators on the case experience another shocking revelation that would prove undeniably strong enough to formally lay charges in the series of violent murders. But the suspect is not this Gabriel, but rather previous suspect Madison Mitchell herself. Shocking police records indicate while investigators visit the home, a then unidentified woman quite literally burst through the ceiling, startling both witnesses and attending police alike. It would seem that the victim was being held captive in the attic of the Mitchell residence, and in her frantic attempts to escape her confines, she quite simply fell through the insulation and drywall of the home all the way down to the first floor, where miraculously, she managed to fall quite literally at the feet of local police. And upon detaining the victim in question for medical attention, investigators execute a search on the attic inside the house, where they find a plethora of evidence linking Madison Mitchell to the recent series of murders and identifying her as the alleged killer. Now, this evidence includes the murder weapon used in the series of killings, confirmed by trace blood samples from the blade of the trophy weapon itself, as well as an outfit and gloves that match Detective Shaw's own description of the killer from his altercation just one day prior. Investigators also make a huge leap forward in the case when they identify this victim as local missing person Serena May, who operated as a tour guide of Seattle's historic underground tunnel network and had gone missing just a few days prior. And while on the surface this kidnapping and confinement seems random in nature, DNA testing on Serena May would indicate a surprising connection to her kidnapper. This victim in question was also suspect Madison Mitchell's biological mother. Now, it's important to note here that both police records and medical journals would indicate that Madison Mitchell had been adopted at 8 years old by the Lake family, including her adoptive mother Jean Lake and her aforementioned sister Sydney Lake. Now, unfortunately, due to the medical injuries sustained during her captivity and subsequent escape, Serena May fell into a coma and as such was unable to provide any context to the case. But at this point, police have pretty much all they need to formally implicate Madison in these series of killings, as well as the kidnapping and unlawful confinement of her own biological mother. Madison Mitchell is arrested and taken into police custody, where she's detained in preparation to be fully charged with capital murder. Investigators speculate that Madison had some kind of a psychotic episode, either before or after the murder of her husband Derek, during which, fueled by paranoid and potentially stress-induced hallucinations, she began to lash out at individuals that she may have even subconsciously blamed for the wrongdoings in her own life. Namely those who psychoanalysts theorize Madison may have felt damaged her own psyche as a child. Now, this includes Madison's mother, Serena May, who records indicate gave Madison up for adoption at childbirth under her birth name, Emily May. Now, based on the suspect's own statements, coupled with accounts from an attending psychiatrist, as well as supporting corroborating impact statements from step-sibling Sydney Lake, the supporting case theory here is that Madison may have manifested an alter ego of the aforementioned Gabriel character, a childhood imaginary friend that she used to mentally compartmentalize her own murderous actions without directly implicating herself in the killings. Now, this would also explain how Madison had some sort of a recollection of all of the murders, including having allegedly seen this killer in question committing the crimes themselves. She had suffered what can only be described as an almost out-of-body experience, her own fragile mind's way of dealing with the guilt of her own involvement. It seems like an open and shut case to Detectives Shaw and Moss, but while these theories seem plausible on the surface, the truth would be even more shocking and twisted than anyone involved could have possibly imagined. The serial killer in these 2020 Seattle murders was, in fact, the individual from police sketches known only as Gabriel. However, the murderer was also Madison Mitchell, only this wasn't a case of multiple personalities. Madison and Gabriel were siblings, two entirely separate people with individual forms of consciousness. Only they happened to share the same physical body. Now, to better understand this, we have to go all the way back to 1993, and specifically to the Seattle-based medical facility, Simeon Research Hospital. Extensive medical records obtained by police, which includes actual video evidence, detail a particularly involved case at the hospital that was being attended by numerous highly decorated medical professionals. And as investigators would confirm, this team of experts in question were none other than Doctors Weaver, Fields, and Gregory, all of whom would become the victims of Gabriel and Madison some 27 years later. But the nature of this case at Simeon Research Hospital would prove to be highly irregular, and it involved both future murder suspects Gabriel and Madison directly. Medical records confirm that Gabriel, previously thought to have been an alternate form of consciousness created by Madison Mitchell, was in fact his own unique person, and he was quite literally growing out of Madison Mitchell's own body. In video medical journals, one can clearly see that Gabriel actually at some point had a corporeal form, including his own appendages and an actual human face. Medical diaries indicate that during childbirth, Emily May, who would later grow up to be Madison Mitchell, had what seemed to be a conjoined twin, only the twin had not fully formed, and instead grew only partially as a physical form on Emily's back. And while his physical body was severely disabled due to the nature of its stunted growth, it was indeed an individual person, and as records would indicate, had his own unique and violent persona. This scientific anomaly resulted in the two twins sharing portions of the same brain, with Emily's cognitive functions serving as the more dominant of the two, given the more developed body mass that she presented. Now, it would be no surprise at all if you're asking yourself at this point, how did this Gabriel persona remain hidden throughout Madison Mitchell's entire adult life? And further, how did nobody notice the obvious physical presence on Madison's own body? After all, Gabriel's form was located on her back, as well as the rear of her skull, where his face was asphyxiated. The answer to these questions can be explained through the culmination of the medical phenomenon back in 1993. Behavioral analysts indicate that during the observation of Emily and/or Gabriel during her stay at Simeon Hospital, it was clear that both individuals had their own unique consciousness, only at the time, only one of them could control the physical body at any given point. In various psychological assessments, it was deemed that Gabriel's consciousness was extremely aggressive and often violent in nature. Now, this would result in numerous violent attacks on orderlies and other patients within the hospital. And it's ultimately decided by the team of medical experts that physical control of Emily's body should instead be given to none other than Emily herself. As such, in a procedure that's since been heavily criticized as unorthodox and controversial, a team of surgeons, led by future victim Dr. Weaver, performed the near entire removal of Gabriel's physical form from Emily May's body. And due to her own specialty in plastic surgery, Dr. Weaver was able to mostly contain or reconstruct any recovery wounds that may have potentially raised questions down the road. Now, the hope here was that Emily May would one day grow up to be a functioning and able adult, with potentially no memory of this extensive trauma she experienced as a child, and most importantly, no ties to this violent Gabriel twin at all. Only it would be a task that would prove much more difficult and complex than Weaver initially theorized. During surgery, it's discovered that Gabriel and Emily shared enough of the same brain that the entire removal of Gabriel's own brain tissue, and thereby his consciousness, would prove fatal to then 8-year-old Emily. As such, it was decided that the surgery would be restructured to instead repress and contain this brain tissue, almost locking it out of the major cognitive brain functions. In addition to this procedure, the medical team at Simeon Hospital administered extensive electric shock therapy to the portion of the brain thought to have been inhabited by Gabriel's own consciousness, in an attempt to hopefully render his persona completely and utterly brain dead. Now, miraculously, the procedure works. In the weeks following the procedure, Emily gains full control over her body and seemingly has no recollection of the events. She's adopted by the Lake family under the name Madison and goes on to live a normal life for nearly 27 years. Only, as records would show, this normal life would prove to also be subjective. Post-investigation interviews with Madison's adopted mother indicate that Madison did actually suffer from delusions for her entire childhood. She would often be found sleepwalking in the home, as well as talking to an imaginary friend, a voice in her head that would sometimes urge her to do things that were otherwise deemed violent or unusual. And this voice had a name, and it was Gabriel. It would appear then that the initial surgery procedure in 1993 was actually only a temporary solution, albeit one that lasted 27 years. And before the investigation in 2020 would conclude, Gabriel May's killing spree would famously explode, resulting in an unforeseen and arguably preventable series of deaths at the hands of this violent serial killer. Now back to these more modern-day murders. At this point, Madison Mitchell has been arrested and locked up at Seattle Police Station, the same location that would become probably the most notable crime scene in the entire case. And it's only while she's incarcerated here that investigators are simultaneously discovering the medical proof of Gabriel May's own existence. So ultimately, police actually had no idea exactly who or what they were harboring in the prison cell of the Seattle precinct. If reports are accurate and to be believed, a staggering total of 37 bodies are located within different areas of the Seattle police precinct. The victims here included extensive police officers, as well as numerous prisoners being held in incarceration. And as documentation of offenders therein indicates, these prisoners included Madison Mitchell, who would later be located in a different part of Seattle entirely. Investigators believe that the initial outbreak of violence here likely started within the confines of the prison ward, as the time of death of the various victims found inside seemed to indicate that they probably died first. Now, their specific causes of death seem to range, but all were killed from extensive physical trauma, the result of a violent hand-to-hand attack. Crime scene pictures and subsequent forensic evidence indicate that this violence continued into the precinct itself, where gunfire was exchanged with the suspect. The numerous police officers killed in the attack were murdered with a combination of gunfire as well as various fatal stab wounds from a sharp object. Now, a proper search of the building as well as blood trails suggests that Gabriel, likely operating under the guise of Madison's body, somehow broke free of his own confinement and procured his original murder weapon from evidence lockup from within the police station itself, and that he was able to use this weapon to fatally wound many of the guards and police officers on staff that night. And similar to other victims in the case, it appears that any and all handprints left behind from the killer are somehow upside down. Now, it's reported from survivors of this case that Gabriel May had a very unique way of moving about while inhabiting Madison Mitchell's body, described almost as if he was moving backwards. Now, as implausible as this may seem, experts tend to agree that this actually is entirely possible, given the fact that Gabriel's own corporeal form was located on Madison's back, including the back of her skull where his human face was present. As such, it's quite possible that Gabriel's own motor functions operated completely in reverse, explaining the bizarre upside-down prints on all of the previous crime scenes. Responding Seattle CSI officer Winnie finds two survivors of the massacre, none other than lead detectives Kakoa Shaw and Regina Moss, and as their statements would indicate, they clearly implicate Gabriel May in the murders at the police station therein. The violent massacre at the Seattle precinct would not be the final crime scene in the murders that rocked the community in 2020. Gabriel, or more accurately Madison Mitchell, would ultimately be located at the nearby Seattle Medical Hospital. Responding officers led by a severely wounded Detective Shaw are able to successfully locate and arrest the suspect, and also find surviving victims Sydney Lake and Serena May, who had seemingly been the victims of some kind of assault at the hands of serial killer Gabriel May, yet somehow miraculously survived. Now, details of the events at this final crime scene can only be based on statements from both Madison Mitchell and survivor Sydney Lake, combined with police statements from Detective Shaw. Both impact statements tell the same story, that Gabriel May, still operating the body of Madison, had proceeded to the hospital in the hopes of completing his murder spree of those that had initially wronged him as a child. culminating with the potential murder of his own birth mother, Serena May, who had been stationed at this hospital, receiving extensive medical attention since her discovery by police a few days earlier. At some point during this hospital attack, after an exchange of gunfire at the hands of Detective Shaw, it seems as though Madison regained control of her own physical body and is able to fend off the suggestive power of her twin brother, Gabriel. Now, how she was able to do this is anybody's guess, though psychoanalysts claim that this may have been entirely possible due to the complex structure of the twins' shared brain. It's heavily theorized by medical experts that Gabriel was able to access areas of the twins' shared brain that controlled visual stimuli, possibly explaining Madison's own bizarre and hyper-specific visions as the murders progressed, and that it's also quite possible that Madison was able to instead turn the tables, as such mentally locking out her twin brother from controlling both her mind and body as a result. In either case, whether you believe that Madison Mitchell used this alternate persona as a way to enact and possibly even get away with murder, or if you actually do believe in the manifestation of serial killer Gabriel May simply piloting Madison's body as a vessel in executing these murders, the investigation would conclude with Madison Mitchell's apprehension, where she was rumored to have undergone extensive psychiatric evaluation prior to any sort of potential trial proceedings. Both the violent murders themselves, as well as the radical medical phenomenon that resulted in this parasitic twin killer, would haunt the city of Seattle and puzzle the medical community for years to come. Most prominently, many have to wonder if Madison Mitchell was able to mentally subdue her killer twin. Just how stable exactly was this individual? And could it be possible that one day Gabriel might resurface both mentally and physically to wreak havoc over Seattle once again? Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on Malignant. This movie gets a lot of flack out there, and for the life of me, I just cannot understand why. It's well directed, amazingly shot, with a great score, and what's in my opinion, a pretty original story. No, I knew nothing about this film going in, beyond the fact that it was directed by James Wan, the same person who brought us franchises like The Conjuring and Insidious. And despite trying to figure it out along the way, I was completely and genuinely caught off guard by the twist at the end. The story of an almost parasitic, murderous conjoined twin is just so interesting to me, and if you've seen the movie, the way that Gabriel moves almost completely backwards while inhabiting Madison's body is just so wild and original. The third act definitely jumps the shark a bit and leans heavily into the more action horror spectacle, and while in my opinion it mostly works, the movie is definitely strongest in its first two acts, where the killer's identity is a puzzle to be solved. Hopefully, if you were interested in the premise at all, you took my advice in the intro and watched the movie first, but in case you didn't and still love all that spoilery goodness, it's currently available to rent or purchase off some streaming platforms, including Prime. And that's all for this week's episode. Next week we'll officially launch our bonus episode with some behind-the-scenes goodies, so be sure to check that out in addition to our true crime twist. As always, I'm your host Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.